Hello everybody, welcome back to my series discussing the mechanics of the game and the math behind how it all just works. Today, I'm going to be answering some questions that I've seen quite often about how nature just impacts things. Now, as you can see here, I got my calculator up that I made last time for helping speed to figure out the reality of how much helping speed impacts a Pokemon's output and productivity. Today, I want to go over those other subskills in nature. Now, it's a bit easier to see, but the real thing that I want to focus in on is just how much that nature impacts the problem and why we really want a beneficial nature and really don't want a bad nature. So, if we have a skill specialist, now I just put in skill trigger here because it actually fits. If I write ingredient finding, then I'd have to expand this column, and I don't like that as much. So to keep it neat, I made it skill trigger. But all the stuff on this page applies exactly the same to ingredient finding as it does for skill triggers, because the math behind skill triggers and ingredient finding is identical. So now, if you're to have the skill trigger M, it's a 36% boost overall. Now, I have this if additive and composite boost. I'll get to what the difference is, but what you want to know is that this composite boost is the reality. This is the actual boost that you're getting from Subskills in nature from this. Now, skill trigger S brings it to a 54% boost. That's really strong. And now here's where things are interesting though. If we have the ingredient finding down, or skill trigger down, that brings it down to a 23.2% boost. Now, the difference here is that this if additive is what it would be if you, instead of multiplying the nature with the subskills, if you added them, as some people seem to think it is. Because one of the most common questions that I see is, oh, my Pokemon has a skill trigger down nature and a skill trigger as subskill. It's 20%, 18%. Does the math check out that it's only a 2% hurt, and having the second skill trigger M then subsequently makes up for that, and it's like having skill trigger M on its own? The answer is, if the math worked out that way, yes, it would be like 34%, pretty close to 36%. In practice, these are going to be about the same. But the reality of it is that this nature works multiplicatively with the subskills, meaning you are multiplying this 80% by the 154% you're gaining from the subskills, and because of that, it's not making your base rate 20% weaker alone. It's making these subskills also 20% weaker at recovering from the loss on nature. So if you have that help speed down, or that skill trigger down subskill, you're not getting 18%, you're actually getting 80% of 18, which is only 14.4%, which the math checks out there. If you look here, it actually comes out to 5.6% in the negatives. So in reality, it's not that close, and the down nature is just terrible, because then if you're thinking, oh, this skill trigger M will then make up the difference. Well, now the skill trigger M isn't 36% boost. It's instead only 20% of 36%, which is only 28.8%. So the subskills are weakened by the existence of the nature. Now, one very strong thing, however, is that the same thing is true for the up nature, but in the opposite direction. If you were to have this beautiful array of subskills on a skill Pokemon, then you would expect maybe a 74% boost based off the simple math that you'd expect with the 20% just adding these together. But in reality, it comes out to an 84.8%, because now these subskills are boosted by 20% in how much they add to your Pokemon strength. And to answer that question of should you ever even consider like the double skill trigger down nature, I never would, because it's literally weaker than just the skill trigger M on its own, I would maybe think it over just for a second. If I happen to see that it was skill trigger down and help speed up, and had, say, skill trigger S, skill trigger M, and then in level it had help speed M as well. Because I made a third page here, and you can see this. When you take into account all of that, it does come to 59.2% boost when you account for the modifications that help speed has on those sorts of things. But that is a super niche circumstance. Like, in order to have this, it needs to have the help speed up, and then needs to also have pristine skills in order to even be worth considering, because then it would have 59.2% boost, which is just slightly better, is just ever so slightly better than the composite of skill trigger S and M on its own with a neutral nature. Which, if I saw these two subskills on a skills mod and a neutral nature, I'd be happy with it. That's a good skills mod. And the same thing would be true with the help speed up, and then the help speed M, and the down nature. It's just unfortunate, because it could be a lot better if it wasn't a down nature. But yeah, that's... Now, as for nature's impact on help speed, because I didn't go over this too much in the last video, help speed is impacted very differently by the nature. It impacts the same way, but since we have the whole inverse thing there going on there, the math is very unique. The help speed down nature versus the help speed S. In reality, that actually does come out to a minus 2.2, which is close to the minus 2 that we would expect from this if we were going off the simple math. Which, that is a lot more manageable, kind of how I was discussing with the fact that it's actually a 9.1% decrease instead of the 10% you'd expect. Additionally, yes, it does make the impact of these less impactful, but because of just how the math is handled, it handles very, very differently when dealing with help speed specifically. So, while I wouldn't recommend help speed down on Pokemon that particularly like it, help speed down is always bad. Like, there's not a single Pokemon that enjoys help speed down or even is not bothered by it. Every Pokemon in the game is bothered by help speed down. But it's easier to manage than something like this. Because even if I look at just help speed down alone versus this neutral, or this down, if you were to get both down, that'd be really, really bad. But this neutral versus that's a minus 9.1%. This neutral versus this down, that's 20%. So, and overall, the help speed up with that down is a net decrease of minus 11.1%, which that's the only reason why I think having this nature is a bit more manageable with that. In fact, it's probably actually better to have help speed M and skill trigger app. Well, maybe even help speed S. I don't know. Let's see. 53%. That's also fairly okay. Not quite as good as the 54 that you get from these two combined, but still, like, really, really close. A difference of 1%. So, yeah. I hope you've learned something a little bit more about nature. A little bit more about the math behind how the nature works. And hopefully you know exactly why nature is just so important in this game. Thank you.